Next, we have Dr. Sunni. Dr. Sunni is a qualified culinary medicine coach. He's a personal trainer and a scientist. And he has actually a very interesting talk prepared for us. And just to mention, if you have any comments or any questions, just type it in the comment box, and I will make sure to ask at the end of the presentation. So, Sunni, are you there?
Yes, I'm there, Layla. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Hi.
Great. Good afternoon. Great. So thank you, Layla, and thank you for Dr. Shireen as well in terms of what you're doing with plant-based health professionals and the opportunity for me to be able to talk today. Shireen gave an amazing talk and a case study and said it's never too late. And I'm shifting gears to look at the other side of the age spectrum. And I'm going to talk about modern day considerations with millennials and Gen Z when we talk about plant-based diets and health considerations. Layla's already mentioned my credentials. Aside from that, the reason why I went plant-based is that I've had Crohn's colitis with IBS for over 7 years, and plant-based science and evidence-based science has really inspired me to change my culinary habits, but also help coach others to make that kind of transition and positive long-term health gains. So when we talk about the generations of the ages, I just wanted to provide a context of when I'm talking around Gen Y or millennials, these are individuals that are born between 1981 and 1994 to 6, whereas Gen Z, which is our newest generation, are born between 1997 and 2012. Where you all fall, you can use this as your kind of inspiration in terms of what label you are. Regardless of the labels, what we are realizing that obviously is today's young people differ from yesterday's. Every generation has had an environmental, socioeconomic, or an event that labels or characterizes particular traits that will define the way that we perceive and the way that we act and the way that we actually form our ways of life, our morals, and also actually our diet lifestyles. You'll see that Gen Z are really consumed around being more ethical and around this centering values of uniqueness, whereas Gen Y are all about experience, flagships, and more of a globalist opinion. And this really shapes and forms how we as either healthcare professionals or just individuals looking to make considerations in what we eat will also frame what we do in terms of a lifestyle and diet considerations. So this gives a really important consideration, which is a millennial a millennial a millennial? And it's really important that we discuss the fact that there is a lot of discussion in terms of social evidence and social studies around the different archetypes that define a particular generation. By using such heavy labels as a millennial or Gen Z, we're grouping a cluster of generations, but making a lot of assumptions. And these assumptions could define how we view or perceive the diet and considerations, the nutritional considerations of different people. And I particularly like this quote from David Greiner, who's a well-known journalist, who said, if there's one thing that every millennial hates, it's an overly broad generalization of what every millennial thinks. And as a millennial, this resonated to me drastically so, because this has also shaped the way that I've gone through my personal healthcare journey in terms of sometimes healthcare professionals or even individuals as millennials, we tend to make broad assumptions and general considerations on how we should go about making different considerations in our diet and lifestyle. So it's really important in terms of why I felt this important topic would be of use in Global Vegfest. And I think it's characterized by a number of factors. First is we need to recognize that from an economic standpoint, millennials have reached what we feel are now the most important age range. So we dominate the workforce in terms of middle and senior management and have the largest generation of management and disposable income. Gen Z account for 32% of the world's population and are now pipelined as the most influential generation of our time. Now, these are quite stark kind of thoughts around the modern day generation, but it really does frame in terms of what we think as scientists, as healthcare clinicians, but also as the broader generation in terms of why is it so critically important and why do we start seeing far more marketing generated around these core groups, but also why there's been such a transition in plant-based and vegan dining and marketing to tailor and cater for these generations. But it doesn't stop there. So we're seeing more and more growing evidence that millennials now make up over a third of all vegans. 25% of young British millennials now find that going vegan is more appealing, especially with COVID-19 having an impact. Now, Shireen spoke beautifully and eloquently around the impact of COVID-19 and particularly diet strategies that can help combat or reduce the risk of severity in COVID-19 or hospitalizations. And you can see now that this is the forefront of younger generations' minds in terms of what we eat and the impact it has, not just on health years and outcomes, but also in terms of traversing the pandemic that we're facing today. Also, when we look at socioeconomic and psychosocial outcomes in terms of questionnaires and marketing generation, we're noticing that Generation Z do want to be meat-free by 2021 and beyond. So there's definitely a need and a drive to meet the growing demands, and it falls on us all now to actually have those due responsibilities and see and actually speak to drivers of global change and how we meet those needs. And we all know that one of the factors other than health is around climate change and the climate responsibility that we have as citizens of this planet. And it's quite stark in terms of the numbers, where 41% of Gen Z feel that climate change is the single most important issue. So let's have a quick look in terms of the influences and confounders in terms of what defines and helps impact the decision-making of younger generations. There's no escaping the fact that the younger generation are a digital generation. We embrace information gathering, dissemination, and our understanding of information through digital and technological means. We also know that technology is adapting at a faster rate than innovation than the Industrial Revolution, which is extremely apt for the UK, as we were the center and the hub of growth during the Industrial Revolution. We're also noticing that mobile first information is a growing expectation. This is going to shape the way that we all work together and also drive that information and needs to actually make those positive lifestyle changes. Where we are able to access and digest information, digital experience is extremely important. And these numbers show you in terms of how much the internet is driving decision making and also how we can drive an impact. There's a definite growing need and desire for globalization compared to previous generations, and this is shaping our trends in food. There's definitely a globalization in terms of our food tastes and preferences, and we're noticing that 43% of US millennials are now non-white, so there's definitely a dissemination of ethnic flavors, ethnic networking, and then despite China's former one-child policy, it has 400 million millennials. So we are definitely shaping the way in terms of strategy, food diversification, and the growing needs. A really interesting fact is that if half the world now uses a smartphone, 75% have access to a mobile device. So you can see where this is also impacting fake news and also disinformation and misinformation. This is where we all as a global community really need to help drive that forward drive of information. Social networking is a key factor in terms of the way that we deliver and disseminate and digest information. And I've mentioned the power of misinformation and disinformation. And we're noticing this actually plays a critical part, especially when it comes to the vegan movement and plant-based diets and information, especially when it comes with climate change and the political agenda. And it's also impacting decision-making and the buying power overall. So this really shapes the overall ecosystem and network of how the younger generation really do drive their decision making. And then also we need to consider the fact that mobilization is also a key factor in terms of the way that we drive our decision making, and also how veganism and plant-based eating is really being able to be mobilized across the global network. Personal globalization is very key now. We're noticing that there's limitless cross-border movement, communication, and economic power decision-making and movement of money. And we're also noticing that today's school leaver is expected to have at least 17 jobs across 5 careers and live at least 15 homes in their lifetime. This is obviously going to have a huge impact on diet and lifestyle. And this is where actually making the right decisions and considering what are the health needs of the younger generations will really shape and inform why going through a plant-based lifestyle really does help meet the growing modern day needs. And finally, this is just an information as an FYI. Visually stimulating communication is going to be ever more paramount and of importance for the younger generation. We're seeing that YouTube is the close second global search engine. And we're also noticing that the preference around communication is around visual stimulation. And this is driving the way that the global movement of veganism and plant-based eating is really driving this decision-making as well. So let's talk more around the health trends and what are the growing concerns of the younger generation, also how plant-based and vegan foods really do meet those growing concerns of health trends, as we know that this community is going to be the largest global community in the world when it surpasses 30% in the next few years. Some of the food trends are particularly around street food and a preference around eating out. So there's definitely a departation from at home, that social dining at the dining table, to actually embrace more street food and accessible, convenient foods. I've already mentioned that there's a progressive departure from traditional to ethnic dining. And you'll see some of these statistics really show this stark transition from at-home dining and cooking to more complete meals and pre-prepared meals. This obviously from a healthcare perspective also is a watch out in terms of when we look at not just COVID, but long-term health conditions and communicable diseases, where combining plant-based eating and pre-prepared foods, we need to consider the trans fats, the unsaturated fats and refined sugars, and how that will impact the younger generations as we start going forward. Interestingly, the eating habits are particularly different to older generations. We're noticing that 23% of Gen Z prefer snacking and smaller meals. But we're also noticing that the celebrity endorsement is encouraging energy-dense and nutrient-poor foods and beverages. And this is where really advocating plant-based foods is really going to counteract this growing endemic and pandemic of obesity and IGT, so impaired glucose tolerance and pre-diabetes in younger generations. And so healthy habits is coming as a foremost need in healthcare professionals. So Shireen already spoke briefly around about psychosocial impact and where diet plays a role. And I won't dwell a lot on COVID-19, but we need to also remember that for the younger generation, although they haven't all been grouped by many global governments as vulnerable groups, they are having a global impact in terms of maladaptive health habits. We're noticing the highest rate of clinical significant anxiety in the modern age, and COVID-19 related concerns that is traversing into the workplace and at-home lifestyles. Interesting data in China as well is coming out that we're noticing that more younger individuals are developing anxiety and depressive symptoms as a consequence of COVID, and that socioeconomic status does play a consequence to health disparities and access to food. And this is a growing concern, not just in school children or children of school and educational age, but also of millennial and Gen Z age as well. So in terms of the health issues that are as a growing concern in the younger generation, where plant-based diets can really play a part, I'm going to cover three key and core concerns. The first being mental health. This has obviously gained a lot of traction in the public eye, and the data is stark and harrowing. And when we look at US data, there's very little in the UK, but in the US, we're noticing that there's a large exponential recorded rate of growing increase in, despite the generation and despite the race, of growing anxiety order and symptoms in the younger generation. We're also noticing that there's substantial increases in colorectal cancers, and this is data taken in high-income countries, which includes the EU5 and the UK. And the graphs below show that when we take different subtypes of colorectal cancers, so proximal, distal, or rectal, you'll notice that the trends are showing a substantial increase, and we're seeing that slowly growing in the younger generation of concern as well. And then finally, gut health. So Shireen again spoke a lot about gut health. Gut health is extremely close to my heart, and we've spoken about the power and impact that the gut microbiome and gut health plays in terms of overall linking immunity, skin health, brain and respiratory health. But we're also noticing that this data has been taken from market research, that 74% of those with gut issues report frequent bloating, constipation, and 50% of younger generations, in particular millennials, are noticing that they suffer from these symptoms in every single week. We notice that this is a consequence of poor gut health, and surprisingly, although that a lot of these millennials feel that they're meeting their 30 grams of fiber recommended daily allowance a day, only 8% of millennials are actually reaching that. So this is also playing a pivotal part in why millennials are suffering in these types of conditions linked to poor gut health. So the important question here is, knowing that we know that there's different subtypes in terms of the archetypes and what's driving the decision making and influences of millennials and Gen Z, but also what are the health concerns? The most important question is, does tailoring interventions and plant-based diets really help in the younger generations? There's an abundance of data in looking at chronic illnesses in the working population and older generations, and slowly there's more and more information coming about around the younger generation. So I won't go through all this information, but it's really showing that, for instance, in mental health, there's already strong evidence in the emerging field of the microbiome gut-brain axis, and that there's a significant correlate in terms of the risk factors for depression and anxiety disorders and the symptoms with an unhealthy diet. We're slowly seeing that nutritional intervention is playing an important role in brain health and function as well as mood, because it provides a rich abundance of polyphenols, antioxidants, but also neurotransmitter function and survival in terms of the maintenance of serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, but also GABA, which helps us with the strong influence between the brain and the nervous system. And this data is slowly showing that this is actually down to an altered microbiome status, also systemic microbial and metabolic alterations, which is obviously helping to reduce the factors around impaired glucose tolerance and metabolic syndrome, which could play a part in dysregulation in cognitive function and mood. When we look at colorectal cancers, there's a strong understanding that an oversupply of heme iron, which is typically found in meat and red meat in particular, plays a strong atherogenic and growth promoting influence, especially in GI cancers. And we know that there's evidence around how this is then being degraded into TMAO, which not only influences cancer risk, but also atherosclerosis and increases the factors and risk factor for heart disease. We also know that saturated fats typically found in animal-based products are impacting the gut microbiomes, which impacts the function of bile production and the acid pool, generating tumor-promoting secondary bile acids. And we know that animal protein favor these taurine conjugations and the TMAO hydrogen sulfide genotoxic compound release. And the last column there shows you, though, we are seeing some evidence that if you start implementing plant-based or vegan diet, it does confer a reduced risk, namely around the proportion of 15% in the incidence of total cancer. When we look at gut health, we are starting to see, and there's an abundance of evidence showing that a typical westernized diet, which is typically low fiber, high fat, and high carb, which is obviously supported with an animal-based diet, is leading to severe dysbiosis, which is obviously an imbalance in the gut-friendly bacteria with the more toxic and atherogenic promoting gut bacteria, which is ubiquitous in IBD and IBS. Some of the bacteria that are promoting these changes in dysbiosis are named in the study, showing that actually these are the promoting issues around IBD and IBS, where we can actually see higher remission rates in symptoms, particularly in IBD and IBS, with a higher fiber and a promoting diet through plant-based items, and a plant-based diet where it favors the bacteria. So what are the final considerations when we look at this overview of data? I think we first need to be mindful of the stereotyping of generations, knowing that our needs are very different. The way that we will consider and take on a plant-based diet will also change in terms of the convenience and accessibility. And so we need to consider how we make plant-based and whole food products more accessible to the younger generations, and also consider how we impart information, knowing that the power of digital really does inform decision making, and also that younger generations are now going to form the largest demographic, and that they do have many health concerns. I've only touched on 3, but there are so many others in terms of skin health. Gut health is an increasing issue around the younger generations, and we're seeing that plant-based diets really do play a supportive role through different underlying mechanisms, not only just through the gut microbiome and SCFA release, but also in terms of helping the immune response, and also that central nervous link between the gut-brain axis. There's also a drive now that we need to be able to support younger generations through a more considered approach. And that's why options like holistic coaching, the plant-based health professional online coaching and support really does help people take them on the journey of supplementing the right plant-based diet. And a key note here is we shouldn't forget the Generation A. So Generation A are children born between 2012 and onwards, and these will continue through to 2025 and are most likely going to be the largest population, surpass Gen Z. And we're noticing a transition where the younger generation of Millennial parents and Gen Z parents are imparting a vegan diet to these younger generations. We need to ensure that there's a balance of veganism and that the power of plant-based dining and eating, and the positive healthcare benefits that it can play. So with that, I want to thank you all for listening. It really was a whirlwind tour of younger generations and the considerations. There's a lot more deep diving and a need for more research in this area, but please do feel to reach out should you want more information or support on coaching. And with that, I'll hand back to Layla, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Sunni. That was very interesting, I must say. I really enjoyed it. I think it's such a actually interesting topic and very relevant, because so many parents actually reach us to us. How can I talk to my children about it? And as you mentioned, we shouldn't forget about those younger children. And I'm just going to go through the questions first. I have a question myself, but let's just go through the questions. Do you think there is too much emphasis? Do you think too much emphasis is placed on nutritional aspects of health and not enough on the spiritual aspects of health, such as prayer, transcendental meditation, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think the reason why there's more of a nutritional focus is because if we put COVID aside, and I think COVID has obviously hyper-escalated the nutritional aspects of health on the forefront, I think nutrition has always been the go-to and the foremost understanding of why plant-based diets do play an active role. And when we look at the needs of younger generations, other than climate change, health and nutritional aspects do actually define why they make the decisions of transitioning into diets. There's nowhere, and there's some limited evidence. I know there's evidence in IBS and IBD, where if you look at the spiritual influence of things like hypnotherapy, meditation, yoga, it does play a positive effect. I think over time we'll start noticing the holistic effects and then work on communications. Fortunately, at the moment, it is focusing mainly on nutritional, but it will change.
Yes, and also one of the things I noticed when you were talking about, when you're doing your presentation, is the anxiety levels, which are actually increasing in younger generations, especially because of COVID. And I think actually meditation, yoga, these holistic kind of practices could actually probably help with that. So hopefully it will be part of the, how we approach the younger generation. So another question, actually that is my question as well. How do we support younger people to make healthier choices and enjoy cooking, as well as we all have the problem of consuming too much processed food and eating out a lot?
Yeah, so I think that's an amazing question. It's the reason why I do what I do. I think there's many factors. I think the first is awareness and information. I think there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation about plant-based eating and how it isn't accessible and how hard and complicated it is. And I think it needs to start at a kind of much higher level, governmental. I'm not going to go down the political route, but I think if we start talking about how fruit and vegetables are cheap and accessible, that actually counteracts many of the hurdles. The other part then is actually driving initiatives at different levels of society. So starting at school, working at the corporate level in terms of with colleagues and with the employee base, and governmental and institutional level to show this is how accessible plant-based foods are. This is how easy and creative you can be with dining. And also just working with the right individuals. So plant-based health professionals being one, Layla's a coach, I'm a coach. We do a lot of things, and it's all about showing and encouraging the power of creativity through plant-based eating. And I think then finally, it's all about the supply and demand story. I think once we start showing that there is more of a demand, the prices become lower, the accessibility becomes easier, you start seeing more availability in your common restaurants. And I think that's when the taboo and stigmatization of plant-based dining reduces, and it will become the norm over time.
Yes, I agree. But at the same time, how do you feel about fast food establishments like, McDonald's, Burger King, having all these plant-based options?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting topic, and it can meander in a number of ways. And I had a really interesting conversation on an entrepreneur in the plant-based space, and I think it's because there's different levels or transitions going to any dietary change. I think the first is awareness, and I think this is why corporates like McDonald's and other large chain are showing the availability of, and I don't want to call them plant-based items, but more vegan items, to show that actually it is available, it is accessible, and it is tasty. But I think the huge responsibility falls on individuals like us to actually then transition them to more healthier choices. Unfortunately, we're not there as a global community. There's been a huge battle just to start getting accessibility and more access to vegan foods, and to show that actually, one, they're tasty, one, they're affordable, two, they're affordable, and three, you can get them in, round the corner in your corner shop. I think then there's this new transition of the health, and unfortunately the corporate world sometimes does take precedent in terms of it's the way that the marketing is. The muck plant burger is now the same price as a beef burger, where many of us would argue, well, actually you'd think it would cost cheaper than the beef burger. But I think there's a transition. I think we will get there. We just need to keep pushing the nutritional advantages of why we need to make it more accessible.
Yes, and I saw something in Starbucks recently. They usually call their cakes like kind of vegan. Well, at least they did until a few months ago. Now it is plant-based. So we have this cake full of fat, sugar, but no salt, and it says plant-based. And I think it just confuses people even more.
Yeah, and I think we've got to be very mindful, especially with the younger generation, because the way that corporations market, and because we're such a digitally savvy and accessible community and generation, we're going to believe that eating something plant-based is far healthier than something that's vegan, and we feel it's still actually meeting our personal values of the climate positivity, the animal cruelty positivity, and the health gain. This is where there's a lot of work that needs to be done at an institutional level to talk about the differentiation.
Yes, we still have a lot of work to do.
Yes, it'll keep us busy, Layla.
And I think it is actually, we just had a very short time available today, but I think it's such an important topic, as I said, because parents who are vegan, but they actually follow a whole plant-based diet and who understand the health aspects, struggle. How do they get the message across to their children? How do they get them on board? And then there is these plant burgers, out there. So it is not easy. It's very challenging. So I really appreciate what you are doing. Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and from the feedback we can see here, people enjoyed it a lot as well. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.